Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, Felicity, for inviting me and for organising this series. In 1685, the Danzig astronomer Johannes Hevelus published his Annus Climactericus, which revisited a 10-year-old disagreement between himself and Robert Hooke, the former secretary to the Royal Society of London. The controversy is a tale of scientific rivalry, powerfully developed egos, and long-held grudges with the suspicion of adultery thrown in. That's the object of the adultery. That is not the adulterer. That's Hevelius himself. The controversy is relatively well known to historians of science, though far more attention has been paid to the earlier manifestations of the disagreement in the 1670s. Than to the last gasp in 1685, which is usually treated as a sort of coda. This talk is not so much about the contest itself as about the institutional framework which make the events of 1685 intelligible. I want to suggest that the controversy, which was over the respective merits of open sights, that's sights with plain glass or no glass at all, and telescopic sights in observational astronomy, threatened not just the idea of civil discourse between natural philosophers and the epistemic credibility of an important technology, but the very structure and the administration of the Royal Society, its relations with other learned societies in Britain, and the continued existence of the Philosophical Transactions, the world's first scientific journal. In essence, I'm treating this episode as a fracture point from which we can read back to trace how ideals of scientific institutionality and models for scientific institutions began to change in the late 17th century. I'll be investigating the overlap between the Society's administration, its practices of publication, and its developing interdependence with other learned societies that began to spring up or to be mooted in Britain in the 1680s. The early Royal Society was beset by many of the same problems that plague voluntary organisations to this day. It depended entirely on the subscriptions paid by its members, on their willingness to donate their time to it, and on occasional freaks of generosity or legacies from rich fellows. Numerous historians have shown how it struggled to maintain the interest and activity of its membership, and it struggled, to say the least, during the 17th century to coordinate or sponsor systematic research. I hope I can say all that without appearing to kick my host in the teeth on this occasion. Although its early membership boasts some of the heroic figures of the early history of science, very well-known figures such as Robert Boyle, John Flamsteed, the Astronomer Royal, the aforementioned Hooke, Edmond Haley, and preeminently, of course, Isaac Newton, many of these men enjoyed fraught relations with it. Some stayed away for long periods, others drifted in and out of involvement with the society as it suited them. Notoriously, those men didn't always get along with one another either. In roughly ascending order of severity, Halley fell out with Hooke and Flamsteed at different times. Flamsteed fell out with Hooke and with Newton. Newton also, on his own account, fell out with Hooke, of course. And Hooke fell out with all of these and many more besides. One of the questions that underlies the notion of how an organisation like the Royal Society ought to organise itself is to ask what the society had to offer the men who had the most to offer it. And the volunteerist conception of it, of an organisation sustained by the contributions of a mostly amateur learned membership, whose mostly genteel status helped to secure the credibility of the knowledge claims it produced and the cachet of the society itself, all of these things paradoxically depended in a voluntary organisation upon the ultra-professional dedication of two individuals. And those were Hooke, the Society's salaried curator of experiments, and later its secretary, and Henry Oldenburg, the Society's extraordinarily energetic first secretary. Oldenburg, as I'm sure many of you know, was born in Bremen in or about 1616. He moved to England in the 1650s. He worked as a tutor to the sons of the gentry for a spell. He was heavily involved in Samuel Hartlib's circle of correspondence. And From 1660, he was one of the Society's first secretaries, alongside John Wilkins, later the Bishop of Chester. Hooke provided the experimental demonstrations. Oldenburg provided the secretaryship. He tirelessly promoted the Society through a vast multilingual correspondence, which now takes up a fairly terrifying amount of any historian of science's shelf. And through his work in editing and compiling the Philosophical Transactions, the world's first scientific journal, as we've said. And when Oldenburg died suddenly in 1677, his death left a vacuum which the Royal Society struggled to fill for a very long time. Part of the problem undoubtedly consisted in finding a secretary willing to work as hard as Oldenburg had for as relatively little reward, and who had his skills not just as a linguist, but as a broker of information and, in the phrase of Marie Boas Hall, a scientific diplomat. But there was a deeper issue, an earlier clash between Hooke and Oldenburg, which had driven a wedge between the Society's two principal spheres of activity. So, as a disseminator and gatherer of natural knowledge on the one hand, as embodied in Oldenburg, and as a primary producer of it on the other, and a place where experiments were actually performed, embodied in the person of Hooke. The bone of contention between Oldenburg and Hooke started life as an accusation from Hooke that the secretary was guilty of conspiring with the Dutch horologist and mathematician Christian Huygens to advance the Dutchman's application for an English patent on a balance spring watch, that's to say a watch regulated by a spring tied to the arbor of the balance. Hooke had claimed to have invented something very similar 17 years previously, and when he discovered that Oldenburg was not only trying to advance Huygens's claim, but that Oldenburg actually stood to be the beneficiary of it, Huygens had offered Oldenburg the rights to an English patent on the invention, presumably in the hope of appearing to be above mere pecuniary interest himself, but unhappily landing Oldenburg squarely in it. Hooke charged Oldenburg both with leaking privileged information concerning his inventions in horology and a malicious negligence in failing to properly record his demonstrations before the Royal Society. From a priority dispute, then, and Hooke's conviction that Oldenburg had betrayed him, the issue developed into a wider disagreement of principle over the fittest way to record and disseminate information in and about the Royal Society. Hooke, as Michael Hunter, among other historians, has shown, argued for a much more stringently controlled method of publication within the Royal Society. He wanted a journal of some particulars read in the Society. It wasn't supposed to be comprehensive. To be circulated only to the members and to authorised correspondence. This idea was to be coupled, in Hooke's design, with much more stringent criteria for admission to the Society. For appropriate levels of expertise and standards of personal probity to obtain in the natural philosophical community, Hooke felt that the Society itself had to be much more rigorous about policing membership of that community than it had hitherto been. It was a conception of the Society designed precisely to deny it the kind of second-order existence it enjoyed in Oldenburg's correspondence and freely circulated journal. What I mean by that is simply that Oldenburg was able to widen the community of potential members and participants in the natural philosophical activity of the Royal Society through letters sent all over Europe, through the dissemination of his journal. Hooke's model wanted the fruits of the Royal Society's activity, credit and knowledge not to be shared outside of a very limited population. The taint of the clash with Oldenburg is perhaps apparent in something that Hooke wrote in an unfortunately undated paper in the Royal Society archives, but which makes evident that the planned criteria for the admission of foreign members to the Society would be particularly stringent. Hooke stipulated that no person that is a foreigner shall be elected a member of this Society that shall not before his election give the Society some signal testimony of his fitness and ability for it by 2 or more discourses upon such subjects as fall under the care of the Society, nor be continued longer thereof than he continueth to send quarterly some such discourse, discovery, experiment, or invention as shall be approved worthy to be accepted by the society and so declared. So in order to justify their access to the materials shown to and produced in the weekly meetings of the Royal Society, foreign members had to be very much more active in the production of useful knowledge than members of the Royal Society themselves would have to be. Oldenburg and Hooke agreed in principle that the Royal Society had a critical role to play in the securing of priority and credit in the manufacture of natural knowledge. They simply disagreed over the means. Oldenburg conceived of that role as consisting in a positive and open relation to a wider learned community, whereas Hooke wanted the society to be as self-enclosed as could reasonably be managed. Hooke's notions, carried to their fullest extent, would have effectively wiped out the practices of publication developed in the society thus far and embodied in Henry Oldenburg, an important feature of which was precisely to publish and promote the association of the society with what its members produced. Hooke had come to the view that too wide a circulation and too free an exchange of information left the English inventor or discoverer, in particular, vulnerable to being defrauded of his best ideas. The processes by which individual and institution reflected public credit upon one another, Hooke felt, ran the risk of vitiating the credit due to each, and it would be better not to allow the identification between them to be made at all, unless the credit could be totally secured, and that's paradoxically by denying all but the most tightly controlled forms of public access. So, to sum up, Hooke wanted a closed shop because he felt that otherwise his inventions were at risk of being diffused too widely. Oldenburg, for what it has to be said were equally self-interested reasons, wanted a much broader dissemination of the Royal Society's activity and knowledge because Oldenburg made his living, or tried to make his living, from the promotion and sale of the philosophical transactions, which were, of course, sustained by the contributions of Royal Society members, amongst others. So Hooke's idea of how the Royal Society should be constituted, again, it's regrettable that we can't date it with precision, whether it was directly inspired by the clash with Oldenburg or merely a prescient anxiety about what might follow from it, we can't say. In spite of this attack on the Society's voluntary basis, the lesson of the clash between the Secretary and the Curator wasn't missed, and the Society endeavoured to assure itself against its reoccurrence. In the first instance, Hooke successfully schemed to take over the secretaryship of the Royal Society from Oldenburg when Oldenburg died in 1677. Hooke's tenure is generally considered to have been relatively undistinguished. By the time he was replaced 5 years later, he'd left the experimental programme untended and the papers in disarray. And part of the reason we know that is that an important chunk of the Royal Society's draft minutes written in Hooke's hand were only recovered 5 years ago. The Society's solution to Hooke's somewhat chaotic tenure was to put teams of people into place. They used 2 curators and 2 secretaries. The parcelling out of the responsibilities involved specifying them, rather than simply allowing the nature of the office to emerge from the conduct of its occupants. The new curators of experiments were given a specific brief. Edward Tyson was appointed in order to bring in anatomical demonstrations, and Frederick Slair was given responsibility for chemical experiments. And over the course of the next year, they produced a number of dissections or reconstructed animal skeletons and experiments on, mostly sulfur and sulfur derivatives. Something similar also happened with the secretaryship. In 1682, Francis Aston and Robert Plot were appointed. Robert Plot is an interesting figure here. He was based in Oxford. He was the keeper of the Ashmolean Museum. And he was also heavily involved with an emergent philosophical society at Oxford. Aston and Plot, between them, very swiftly arrived at their own division of labour. Hooke had allowed the transactions to lapse, speculatively, because he couldn't stand to continue to be involved with anything associated with his dead enemy Oldenburg, and he replaced them with what he called the philosophical collections. These had not run very successfully. There were only 7 issues put out in the course of 5 years, and by the time Aston and Plott took over the secretaryship, they brought in a proposal to relaunch the philosophical transactions scarcely 2 weeks after their election, on the condition that the Society subsidised the production of the journal by taking 60 copies of every issue. It's significant, at least to my way of thinking, that it was Aston who proposed this and not Plott, who's usually given the credit for the journal's revival, since both of them were present at the meeting at which the idea was floated. And what I think is interesting about this is that the running of the transactions effectively changed fundamentally at this point. The physical separation of the 2 secretaries, Aston and Plott, one in Oxford and one in London, meant that there was a constant communication about the activity of the transactions and publishing within them. So although all but the first issue of the transactions for 1682 were printed at Oxford, beg your pardon, sorry, lost my place there. Which is where Plott, as I said, spent most of his time. The preface to the first of the new numbers of the transactions specifies that contributions should be sent to London. Letters for this purpose may be directed thus for the Secretary of the Royal Society to be left with Mr. Hunt at his house or at the repository in Gresham College. So broadly what happened was that Aston became the day-to-day secretary while Plott took over the journal, although there was considerable overlap in practice. The office of secretary, which had been dominated by Oldenburg and then by Hooke, in the, I think, suggestive singular of the preface to the transactions, became exactly that. It became an office with settled responsibilities and was discharged by 2 men who agreed on their own terms which was to do what. The other important effect of this collaboration was to produce much closer relations between the Royal Society and the analogues that were beginning to spring up in the provinces. Although it wasn't formally constituted until October 1683, the Oxford Philosophical Society had been in existence, at least in embryo, as far back as April of 1681. There are letters from Edward Tyson to Robert Plott which refer to a philosophical club, which is plainly a regular, if informal, meeting of people who are discussing natural philosophical matters. Plott, who divided his time between London, Oxford and Kent, was kept informed by Aston and others of what went on in the London meetings he couldn't attend, and that material fed both into the transactions and into the work of the Oxford group. So the development of the 2 societies at this point isn't merely parallel, it's mutual. The same exchanges that came to be crucial elements of both societies arose partly out of the decision to have the transactions published in another city, since the papers and reports on meetings that Aston was passing on for Plott to read and eventually to publish soon became staple fare at the Oxford group's meetings. Fairly soon thereafter, the Oxford and London groups began to send each other the minutes of their weekly meetings. So we have 2 groups who are becoming increasingly enmeshed in one another. Once the Oxford Society had formally convened in October 1683, William Musgrave was appointed as its secretary, and Francis Aston began to write mainly to him, and Musgrave became Aston's intermediary with his fellow secretary, Plott. Incidentally, the appointment of Musgrave is further proof that Oxford and London were becoming ever closer, because Musgrave was appointed secretary of the London group as well in November 1684, again based in Oxford, again printing the philosophical transactions at a distance. So the 2 societies were, I would suggest, becoming so interdependent at this point as virtually to become extensions of one another. So by this time, the letter network and the activities that fed into the philosophical transactions were no longer mediated, as they had been in Oldenburg's time, through a single individual who was slightly offset from the Royal Society and who managed a vast international correspondence. I mean offset in the sense that Oldenburg always protested that the philosophical transactions were never an official Royal Society venture. They were his private publication. He paid for the printing, he took the financial risk, and he stood to benefit from their publication. They came to be associated in the minds of the learned community at large with the Royal Society, of course, but Oldenburg repeatedly insisted, no, they're a private venture, they don't strictly reflect what's going on in the Royal Society. And in fact, during the first, the first 10 or 12 years of the journal's existence, when it was edited by Oldenburg, more than 50% of the material that appears in the transactions gets no mention in the record of the minutes of the Royal Society. So there isn't a precise overlap, and I'd suggest that part of what Oldenburg was up to there was attempting to, rather than strictly speaking, to give an impression of what the Royal Society was up to create a sense of a wider culture which you could buy into by purchasing his journal. After Oldenburg died, the Society's foreign correspondence dropped off dramatically, and the organisation of the network changes. Instead of being a massive international network with a single figure at the centre in a series of highly sort of individuated correspondences and relationships making it up, as had been the case with Oldenburg, between Aston and Plott, you've got one main weekly conduit running between London and Oxford, which is carrying all sorts of other material, and which essentially refashions the network around two discrete centres, whose pools of information and membership overlap considerably but aren't completely coextensive. The journal's production is jointly managed between the two centres, and the consequence, or one of the consequences, is a much greater convergence between the contents of the journal and the weekly meetings in London and Oxford. And from 1683 onwards, there's a third term in the progression as well, because a philosophical society is founded in Dublin at that time by William Molyneux, St George Ashe, William Petty, and others. And that soon becomes another point in the series. So material is minutes of meetings, papers, opinions, letters are exchanged freely through all three of these societies. So, as I've suggested, from 1683 onwards, or 1682/3, when the philosophical transactions are revived, Oxford is much more important to their production, and the material, Oxford is also much more represented in the journal. Far more of the pieces printed in it are coming from within Britain. There's much less emphasis on the status of pieces as items of correspondence. Oldenburg tended to put things into the journal in the form of letters, and under Aston and Plott we start to see much more of what we recognise as the forerunner of the modern scientific paper, in the sense that the framing device of the letter is gone, and it's much more simply the plain presentation of research or observations or a given happening. Pieces originating in Oxford or first read out there began to rival the number of pieces that had first been heard or read out in London in the journal. So by 1683, nearly 30% of papers that appeared in the transactions were first heard at Oxford, compared to about 50% at London. So Oxford isn't dominating, but it's becoming almost equally represented. The exchange of material between the societies also was, again, partly a money-saving device. It seems to have been intended to save the cost of postage. There's a nice letter from William Molyneux in February 1685, when he says, the Oxford Society have... he's writing to Aston here, by the way. The Oxford Society have desired the enclosed papers, and I presume the sight of them might not be unwelcome to you, so that I chose to transmit them through your hands. It was their secretary, Mr. Musgrave, that required them from me. To him, therefore, I desire you to send them with my service, letting him know that the other pieces he demands shall be sent him. And on this occasion I must desire you to let me know whether hereafter I shall observe the method of transmitting what I send to Mr. Musgrave through your hands, for perhaps your satisfaction in reading them or presenting them to the Royal Society may come short of recompensing the charges of postage. The gentleman whose discourse this is desires you to pardon his cacography with his other faults, and cacography is a word that sent me to the dictionary. It turns out to mean awful handwriting. So, as we can see, we've got a system of regular reciprocal exchanges where pretty much all the material appearing in any one of the Oxford, London and Dublin societies is passing through all the others as well. It isn't triangular. Everything seems to be heading through London. That will be an important detail later on. But all of this, although it was successful in reviving the transactions, at least temporarily, it created a potential problem. The physical removal of the journal from London to another site of production inevitably diminished the London Society's central hold over them. Now, although this had been brought about by a notionally desirable division of secretarial labour, and the exchanges which actually managed the journal's production, so the exchanges between the secretaries, had the welcome effect of bringing in additional communications and discoveries from provincial centres of natural philosophical research. They increased the risk that the transactions could be used for purposes that ran counter to the London Society's interests. Now, that was in effect what happened when the Hooke-Hevelius controversy blew up again in 1685. So, a little bit of the background to this. Hevelius was an astronomer based in Danzig. By 1685, he had been observing the heavens for almost 50 years. He was a quite prominent public figure in Danzig. He was the consul, so a civic official. And he had built himself a private observatory on the roof of his house in Danzig. He had his own printing press. It was all very sort of set up as a miniature sort of prince astronomer along the lines of Tycho Brahe, though obviously on a slightly smaller scale. Hevelius was an adherent of open sights in astronomical instrumentation, so he didn't use telescopes on the sites. And Hooke and a number of other English astronomers were just beginning to adopt telescopic sights as the norm. Nothing had been published yet. No catalogue of astronomical observations with telescopic sights had been published, except for Edmond Halley's 1679 catalogue of the southern stars, and again, more of that anon. So when Hevelius described his instruments and his methods of working in the Machina Celestis Pars Prior in 1673, Hooke printed a critique in English in which he praised the Danzig astronomer's achievements but rebuked him for his persistent refusal to use the telescopic sights. Hooke maintained that the refusal to do so set a limit to the possible accuracy of Hevelius's observations to about half a minute of arc at the very best. Hevelius angrily responded that his observations were accurate to more like 5 seconds of arc. And the difference of opinion wasn't a trivial one, since, as I've just said, public skepticism, on the one hand, the refusal of a very highly reputed European astronomer to endorse the use of telescopic sights threatened the integrity and the reputation of a technique on which other leading astronomical practitioners were coming increasingly to depend. On the other hand, calling into question the accuracy of Hevelius's methods was also to call into question the value of his data and to set his very high reputation among European astronomers at the stake. So the problem appeared to have been solved when Edmond Haley visited Hevelius in Danzig in 1679. Halley was 23 at this point. He was newly returned from observing the stars of the southern hemisphere from the island of St. Helena, in recognition of which he'd been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society and awarded his MA from Oxford, Alan Cook, Haley's great biographer, has suggested that that's the first instance of a degree being awarded purely for research in England. And Halley and Hevelius conducted astronomical observations together using both Hevelius's naked eye instruments and a quadrant fitted with telescopic sights that Halley had brought with him. Halley reported that Hevelius's observations and instruments were remarkably consistent, regardless of the user. They were consistently producing observations that were within 5 or 10 seconds of arc of one another, which were results as good as you'd expect with telescopic instruments. And Halley they tallied with the observations from Halley's quadrant rather less well, but Halley was impressed enough with Hevelius's instruments and his skill in handling them. And he also signed a Latin testimonial letter to that effect. Hevelius had been urging a trial of this nature for a while, and he would later claim that Halley had come to visit him in Danzig at his own express request. Now, that was untrue, and that was one of the things that came to involve Halley in the subsequent controversy. So less significantly than his observations, Halley also saw the sights of the town, and according to entirely unsubstantiated 18th century rumour, he also slept with Hevelius's much younger wife. And there was the suspicion of adultery you were promised at the beginning of the talk, and now we'll hear no more of it. At the June the 10th meeting of the Royal Society in 1685, a letter from Hevelius was read informing the Society that he'd sent them several copies of his recently printed Annus Climactericus. By the end of July, the Royal Society had apparently received them and dispatched a copy each to the Dublin and Oxford societies. In the issue of the Philosophical Transactions for September and October, printed at Oxford, a lengthy review of Annus Climactericus appeared, praising Hevelius's achievement and recapitulating in minute and excruciating detail his attacks on Hooke. The review was about 24 quarto pages long, which is pretty unusual for the period. This is fully half the length of the entire journal. The original work, Annus Climactericus, reproduced 27 letters, mostly of complaint about Hooke's handling of Hevelius to and from learned men throughout Europe, and the English reviewer helpfully went through them one by one, summarising their contents. So this 24-page review is essentially a 12-page attack on Hooke, followed by a summary of the work itself. As was normal practice in the early transactions, the review appeared anonymously, but it was fairly plainly written by John Wallis, the president of the Oxford Society, and also a founding fellow of the Royal Society. Wallis had an axe to grind with Hooke about a number of issues. Wallis was another of these 17th century natural philosophers who didn't always find it easy to play nicely with others, and an old friend of Hevelius's. So, following the appearance of this review on December the 9th, 1685, Francis Aston and Tancred Robinson resigned as secretaries to the Royal Society. Aston had been in post for 4 years. Robinson had been in post for 9 days. William Musgrave, who was the editor responsible for the last issue of the Transactions, which contained this review, had not apparently stood for re-election as the Royal Society's secretary. On the same day, that is to say on the 9th of December, a letter from William Molyneux at Dublin was produced, containing his observations upon Mr. Hevelius's Annus Climactericus, and a copy of it was given to Mr. Halley. I'm quoting there from the minutes of the Royal Society meetings. The fact of a copy there is interesting to me, or at least suggestive, and it suggests that the secretaries knew in advance that Halley was likely to take a close interest in the contents of the letter, which is perhaps further evidence of the trouble the episode was causing. The same letter added fuel to the fire by referring to Hooke's animadversions as a pamphlet, which was a term that Hooke warmly resented. Now, Halley's involvement in the controversy stemmed partly from the testimonial bearing witness to the accuracy of Hevelius's observations. This Latin letter was reprinted in Hevelius's book, and worse still, it was directly cited by the English reviewer. Halley found that his affirmation of Hevelius's skill and accuracy as an observer had become an endorsement of Hevelius's position on telescopic sights. He was thus dragooned into an attack on Robert Hooke, and by being so publicly drawn into the debate on Hevelius's party, he ran the risk of seeming to deny the virtues of the observational methods he'd himself employed on his catalogue of the stars of the Southern Hemisphere. And Molyneux compounded the problem by citing Halley's endorsement yet again in support of Hevelius's claims. The problem confronting Halley turned on the interpenetration of the three learned societies in London, Oxford and Dublin. Each was circulating the minutes of papers and meetings to the other two, as we've seen, and the usual conduit was via London. What rendered this dispute especially toxic was that it was at once intramural and international in character. So it's happening across multiple cities and across Europe, but at the same time you could summarise the events like this. So a given member of the Royal Society, that's John Wallis, writes a pungent attack on another member of the Royal Society, that's Robert Hooke, in the guise of a friendly review of a book by a third, Hevelius, who was a foreign member of the Royal Society, in a journal so closely associated with the Royal Society in the eyes of the learned world as to be barely distinguishable from it. And then when a fourth member, or a man who was in the process of becoming a member of the Royal Society, William Molyneux, wrote from Dublin in praise of Hevelius, he inadvertently dragged in a fifth member of the Royal Society, Halley, who now found his own visit to Hevelius being misrepresented, as he saw it, in order to attack Hooke. So by now Molyneux's letter had reached Oxford, and Wallis requested a Latin copy of it. This was certainly for communication to Hevelius, who didn't read English. One of Hevelius's complaints about Hooke, in fact, in Annus Climactericus, had been that Hooke had originally printed his critique of Hevelius in English, so that Hevelius had to go to the trouble of getting the book translated in order to find out that he'd been insulted. Wallis was soliciting contributions, therefore, designed to show that the Europe-wide learned show to the Europe-wide learned community that English astronomers were united in their condemnation of Hooke. Molyneux, who had by this time been made aware of Halley's objections, uneasily confessed in a letter to Halley in April that he had already sent the Latin copy that Wallis had requested, although he had put in a postscript recording some of Halley's objections. Halley replied on May the 27th, this is of 1686 by now, "As to Mr. Hevelius, we hear as yet no further from him, that I am very unwilling to let my indignation loose upon him, but will, unless I see some public notice taken elsewhere, let it sleep till after his death, if I chance to outlive him." The chances were fairly good. Halley was 30 at this point, and Hevelius was in his late 70s. "For I would not hasten his departure by exposing him and his observations as I could do, and truly as I think he deserves I should." So had Molyneux's Latin letter appeared in print, Halley implies, he would have been forced to answer it. Why hadn't the letter appeared in print? It was sent to, it was addressed from St George Ash to William Musgrave in Oxford. It went via Francis Aston. It was certainly sent. The surviving copy of it is sealed and folded, but it's preserved in the Royal Society archives, not in the archives of the Oxford Society. So the inference seems to be that it made it as far as London, but not to Oxford. At least there was no further discussion of it. I'd suggest that that's because Halley saw the letter at this point and decided not to send it on. Following the resignations of the secretaries, the Royal Society had been put into a bit of an uproar, and they had finally decided to appoint a salaried clerk who would essentially do all the work of the secretaryship. It was the final admission that the experiment in voluntary secretaries had failed, and more to the point that the experiment in conducting a joint venture between London and Oxford had failed. So Halley's job was to write and to receive all of the Society's correspondence at this point, and I suggest that if he didn't pass it on that if it didn't get to Oxford, it was because he didn't pass it on, because he didn't trust Wallis to behave well enough not to print it at his own request. So by this time, the Royal Society had appointed a salaried clerk, part of Halley's responsibility was to be the printing of the philosophical transactions. So it looks very much as if this episode involving Hevelius was what effectively brought the transactions back into the fold in London. And I think it can be explained fairly straightforwardly with reference to Wallace's actions. He'd effectively exploited the fact that the transactions were no longer under the Royal Society's direct control, coupled with the perception that they were, to create the appearance of the society uniting to attack one of its own. So he'd successfully expropriated the journal, effectively. And the threat to the integrity of the society was severe enough, as I've suggested, to persuade it to change its institutional organisation yet again by appointing Halley as a salaried clerk. So the rupture in the close cooperation between London and Oxford, which it fell to the clerk to mend, Halley had to write a number of pleading letters over the next 6 months trying to mend fences with the Oxford membership, had a second proximate cause, which was also connected to a joint publishing venture. In addition to the consequences of the Hevelius dispute, the two societies were intimately involved over the production of John Ray's HISTORIA PISCIUM. This was a posthumous work collected from the work of the collaborative work of John Ray and Francis Willoughby, and it's notorious in the annals of the Royal Society because it was the first time the Royal Society had actually paid to undertake a publication directly, and it came within a toucher of bankrupting the Royal Society. It was enormously expensive, enormously complicated to produce on account of the large number of expensive engravings that were required to illustrate it. The production had been batted back and forth between London and Oxford. The Oxford University Press had initially agreed to take it on, then refused on the grounds that the engravings would be too expensive. There's a very good account of its publishing history in Sashiko Kusukawa's article on it. But again, you have a work that was being produced jointly. Although it says it's printed at the Sheldonian Theatre in Oxford, that was only the text. The engravings were produced and printed at London. And the consequences of the publication were pretty dire, as I've said. The Royal Society found itself with only £135 cash in hand after the production expenses. It was completely unsaleable. So much so that famously Halley's salary as clerk to the Royal Society was paid in copies of the History of Fishes, unsold copies valued at £1 apiece. So the London Society's first venture into the realm of natural philosophical publication finally rendered Aston's position untenable, essentially. And entering into the fray as a direct actor compromised the Society's usual professions of institutional neutrality. And by using the Oxford group to help supervise the actual publication, Aston was writing harrying letters throughout this period saying, is it done yet, is it done yet, is it done yet, can you please make sure it's done? They treated their university counterparts somewhat contemptuously as junior partners. So in the same way, in the same way as Henry Oldenburg had found his institutional position damagingly compromised by his adventure into the Hook-Huygens dispute, the Royal Society also found itself suddenly in opposition to its provincial analogue, and the Oxford Society began to contemplate establishing itself as a full-blown rival to the Society. So here's a letter from Robert Plott to Martin Lister, dated February the 14th, 1685/6, so 1686 in the Gregorian calendar. And what's apparent from it is that they began to attempt to poach key London fellows who they thought might be sympathetic. The letter runs as follows. I most heartily thank you for your last, though it brought the ill tidings of the frenzy of the society. Pray be not troubled at it, for the shame at last will turn upon their own heads. I've acquainted my Lord Bishop, that was John Fell, the Bishop of Oxford, who was the superintendent of the university press, with the whole business, who together with his officers of the press can and will justify us whenever there is occasion. I'll assure you I'm so very little troubled at it that the joy I have contrived of the honour you do us here in desiring to be admitted of our society has quite overbalanced it. I hope Mr. Aston, Mr. Flamsteed, Dr. Tyson and Dr. Robinson and some other good friends will follow your example upon this occasion. If so, my Lord Bishop has thought of a good design for advancing the reputation of this society beyond what can be imagined, but of this say nothing. But bring in those men to follow if you can, and you shall know all in good time. Nevertheless, I could not have you or any of the rest throw yourselves out of the Royal Society, for we may live to have a pluck with them for the authority thereto another time. However, we are sure to outdo them in all other matters. No such direct coup ever materialised, but the resentment is plain. The struggles between London and Oxford over the Historia PISCIUM and the Hevelius dispute undermined the Royal Society's collaborative basis, and it turned what had been cooperative relations into openly antagonistic ones as the Oxford Society declared its independence, and thus fragmented any attempt by the Royal Society to provide an overarching institutional foundation for its projects. The ideal of disinterested institutionality, seen in this light, had become not merely a convenient fiction, but an almost inviolable necessity, and the clerkship, which Halley assumed, the salaried post that replaced the volunteerist model of the secretaries, was created in response to this as an essential means of reconstructing the idea of disinterestedness among the primary membership. The dispute illustrates that the tension which always threatened to destabilise the London society, that is, that a given individual might come to suspect that the reward conferred by the society was either too meagre or too abstract to compensate him for relinquishing control of his knowledge claims, and thus to become sceptical of the value of the society as an enterprise, also had the potential, this crisis, to replicate itself on an institutional scale, in this case between London and Oxford, when the Oxford group lined up behind John Wallis, who had reignited the controversy with a stinging attack on Hooke. The difficulty was compounded by the society's interpenetration. The dispute was once both international and intersocietal, and at the same time intramural, which divided loyalties in all directions, but meant that the parent society had the most to lose from the disruption. The appearance of a common purpose was forcibly dispelled by a polarisation of opinion, which cleaved an overarching and broadly sympathetic institutional identity into two antagonistic ones. In other words, the notion that the free exchange of ideas had the potential to subsume individual identity or knowledge claims to the point of denying them integrity occurs at an institutional level as well, and Oxford's self-assertion in the matter threatened to unravel that ideal. The spectre of science being reduced to a fissiparous aggregate of unsubstantiated claims and counterclaims that always haunted the society raised its head again in 1685. Halley was able to use the clerk's position as the physical conduit through which letters between London, Oxford and Dublin circulated to prevent any further fanning of the flames, but the episode had strained to breaking point the attempted enlargement of the natural philosophical community founded on the relations built between London and Oxford over the previous few years. The society, newly sensitised to the danger of letting the transactions, which had been the primary instrument of the dispute, pass out of its central control, had reassigned them to Halley, and one of Halley's first tasks, as we've seen, was to re-establish normal relations between the London group and the provinces, but their independence from one another was much more clearly drawn thereafter. Thank you very much.